So as we celebrate Scout Sunday, as I said earlier, we're honored to have several members of our Troop 16 with us, as well as Dave Banks, parishioner here, former Scoutmaster, member of the Heart of America Council leadership at this point, who is going to be one of the voices in today's sermon.
Good morning. Thank you for having the Scouts here today. And thank you for your involvement yesterday in our centennial celebration. But most of all, thank you for your support. A Scout troop cannot exist without a sponsoring organization, and we're fortunate and blessed to have been a ministry of St. Andrew's for all these years. So thank you. It was a century ago that Dr. Edward Skinner, the first Scoutmaster of Troop 16, called to order the first meeting on a Thursday night at 7 in the evening. In attendance were 24 young men, aged between 12 and 18, and they were all tenderfoot Scouts. They were meeting in the original home of St. Andrew's Church, in the home of their pastor at 58th and Brookside. After calling the boys to attention, Dr. Skinner began by teaching them the Scout oath and law. And it went a little like this. Scouts, please rise, come to attention. Scouts, please join me in the Scout oath. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country and to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times and to keep myself strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. Now, Scouts, please join me in the Scout law. The Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Thank you. Please be seated. I say it went a little like that because at the time of Troop 16's first meeting, Scouting in America was still in its infancy. Scouting in America had only been founded about a decade earlier, but the oath and law remain largely unchanged since that Thursday evening so long ago. The oath and the law are the pillars of our organization, the oath being foremost, but the law being the architecture which holds it all together. Still, today we repeat the oath and law before every meeting we hold, and when a young person is hoping to advance in rank, that Scout recites both before their board of review. However, in time, these recitations become second nature and the words kind of fall from our mouths without second thoughts. But when values and characteristics are so foundational, it's important for us to pause and revisit them. The oath contains 6 promises, and the law has 12 characteristics that all young people should strive for. Now, granted, it's a lot to ask of youth in this modern world, but we do ask. And we ask because we have standards to uphold. It's important for leaders to discuss the oath and the law with young Scouts because Scouting may be one of the few places a young person hears words like courteous, obedient, and thrifty. Not to mention, Scouting is one of the only places that young people are still asked to live up to these principles. But it's up to the Scout and to each of us to make sure that we do. Imagine a Troop 16 Scout hiking the trails of Philmont in the New Mexico wilderness. He's weighted down by 50 pounds of food and equipment on his back. He has a pause to look at his map, take a bearing from his compass, and choose the right path to reach his destination. Only occasionally will there be signs on that trail to help him make sure that he's on the right path. Similar to trail markers, the Scout oath and law are the guideposts to help us find our way, to remind us who we aspire to be. They're also the parameters that other scouts, scout leaders, the scouting organization, all of you expect from us. And they are of the utmost importance because without them, who are we? I don't think it's an accident that the Scout law ends with "a scout is reverent." It's God's awesome majesty that demands our deepest reverence. It's God's power that fills each of our hearts with His love. It's what God asks of us that makes us better people and better scouts. Now, one of today's readings is Psalm 15, and when we read that 15th Psalm, I think it's easy to see it as a source for the oath and law. In this song, David begins by asking, who can sojourn in God's tabernacle? In some translations, that's in God's tent. A tent. I always knew that God loved scouts. David then answers his own question with the definition of those who can come close to God. Among the characteristics he names, David says, there's no guile upon his tongue. He does no evil to his friend. And what David's really saying is the same things that the scouts say, that a scout is trustworthy and loyal. We're just more economical with our words. A scout is thrifty. David goes on to outline other characteristics, but Psalm 15 is there to remind us what God expects of us, of how we can serve Him. Like the dozen young men meeting at 58th and Brookside 100 years ago, learning the Scout oath and law, we are all trying to do our best as we do our duty to God.
Thanks very much, Dave. I appreciate that. It is always wonderful to hear somebody else interpreting Scripture instead of somebody in the collar. That is good. That is good. No, really, it is. You don't have to have the collar to be able to work with Scripture, clearly. I loved how you ended about trying to do our best to do our duty to God. I mean, that is both Scouting's call to young people, and I think Jesus' call to each of us, regardless of our ages. Now, the Scouts here at St. Andrews have had 100 years of practice in trying to live out their oath and law. And that's a good thing, having those markers, those touchstones. You know, it's good to have those summary statements to help us remember how God calls us to act, how God calls us to live in complicated times. Same is true in Scripture, right? I mean, Jesus boils down the Jewish law and the prophets' teaching to this simple two-commandment rule, which you've heard a million times. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else, really, our catechism, our church's mission and purpose statement, the signs outside about passing God's peace, all of that flows from these two commandments, to love God and love neighbor. Seems pretty clear. Of course, where it gets messy is putting that into practice. So last Sunday, if you were here last Sunday, you heard Jesus state this summary of the law only to have a lawyer then pipe up and test him by asking, okay, well, who is my neighbor? Where's the boundary of love? How far do I have to go with this? So, as we heard last week, Jesus then, to the lawyer, tells the story of the Good Samaritan, teaching him and the crowd, everybody who's listening, two things that they did not want to hear. First, that everybody is your neighbor, especially anybody in need. And second, that even the last person you would expect to see as a hero, even like a hated Samaritan in the day, is actually following God's ways when they do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with God. And then just to make sure we don't miss it if it's too, subtle for us, Jesus says, go and do likewise. Seems pretty clear, right? But then, because even the clearest teaching gets tricky in real life, the scene then shifts to today's gospel reading, what we just heard, the story of Mary and Martha, which is a great exploration of what it means to do your duty to God, I think. So right after telling this lawyer to go and do likewise in loving and serving his neighbor, Jesus comes to Mary and Martha's house for dinner. And they welcome him, and, Jesus gets settled, and Mary just cools her heels, sitting there with Jesus, soaking up everything he has to say. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Martha is fuming, right? Getting more resentful by the minute as she takes up the slack and does all the work of putting on this amazing feast that she's orchestrated for the traveling VIP. Well, for centuries, people like me, by the way, have been identifying with Martha in this story and remembering all the times that we were left holding the bag to rescue, group projects at school, right? Or to finish work assignments, or to put on family events, whatever. Somebody has to be the responsible one and put dinner on the table, but why does it always have to be me, right? So Martha's, like me, would love to hear Jesus backing us up on this. Surely go and do likewise would apply in this situation, you would think. And by the way, don't you care, Lord, that those slackers have left me to do all the work on my own? But like Martha, of course, we doers can miss the point. Because loving God and neighbor doesn't mean meeting the expectations that I've set for myself and everybody around me, by the way. Loving God and neighbor means putting God and neighbor first. So I kind of wonder, in this story, did Martha ever ask whether Jesus wanted a big, complicated meal? I mean, would he have preferred some chips and a drink out on the porch instead? Maybe so, really, because clearly what Jesus is valuing here is the heart of the person who's listening to him. Mary has chosen the better part, he says. It's not that Martha's work isn't valuable, because it is. But our hearts have to be shaped for love before the rhythm they'll beat is loving service. So, back to the Scout oath and law. Scouting isn't about laying down rules that young people have to follow because some authority figure has told them they have to follow them. Scouting's about forming young people so that the choices they make honor God and country and help other people at all times and steward themselves as people made in the image and likeness of God. Scouting's forming youth into people who serve in love, knowing that good acts spring from good hearts. And I kind of think that's where Jesus is going with most of us, at least us Marthas too. When we are worried and distracted about our obligations, even if those are holy obligations, it is easy to miss the point of those obligations. Jesus wasn't coming to Mary and Martha's house to eat the best dinner they could prepare. He was coming to Mary and Martha's house to bring the presence of God, the reign and rule of God directly into their midst, there at their dinner table. Preparing a great meal for the traveling VIP was a lovely gesture, but what the VIP wanted wasn't the meal. What he wanted was their hearts. And I think he's working on us the same way. You know, if we see our faith as being all about following rules, we inevitably get stuck worrying and probably arguing about which rules are right or which rules are most important. And if we do actually follow those rules, well, that may well have something to do about trying to earn our way into heaven. And by the way, maybe trying to show up some other people in the process. But I think Jesus isn't asking for that. I think he's asking for our hearts instead. Not because he doesn't value our service, not because he doesn't value following God's way, but because the heart work has to come first. As Dave said a few minutes ago, channeling his inner Mary, nicely done, it is God's awesome majesty that demands our deepest reverence. It's God's power that fills each of our hearts with his love. It's what God asks of us that makes us better people. That heart work has to come first, even for Marthas like me, because when Jesus has our hearts, he knows our hands will follow.